That morning at the Brightmoor Classic Car Auction, no one looked at Silas Grant for more than 2 seconds. He arrived in work clothes, still carrying faint traces of engine grease. One hand holding a folded catalog marked in pencil, the other holding the small hand of an 8-year-old boy wearing a T-shirt printed with a cartoon wrench. When Silas raised his paddle and bid $450 on the rusted, immobile 1968 Camaro shoved into the far corner of the hall, laughter broke out from the VIP section. Rosalind Cade, CEO of Cade Motor Holdings, looked directly at him and spoke just loudly enough for the room to hear. $450? What are you going to do with a pile of scrap metal? The Brightmoor auction wore its wealth the way certain rooms do, like a second skin. Held every autumn at the Brightmoor Exposition Hall, it drew collectors and dealers from 4 states. The hall smelled of leather polish and money. Men in tailored jackets sipped champagne near velvet ropes while 2 auctioneers kept the pace precise and unhurried, the way people manage things when everyone present can afford to be patient. Silas stood near the side aisle, not the VIP section, with his son Theo perched on his shoulders, small sneakers resting against his chest, eyes moving from car to car under the spotlights. Theo had his own copy of the catalog, annotated in green crayon. That one's got a bent bumper, Theo said, pointing at a 1962 Corvette rolling past. Good eye, Silas said quietly. He wasn't there for the Corvette, or the Jaguar that drew a standing ovation at $85,000. He'd come for the last item on the program, Lot 19, circled 3 days earlier the moment he'd read the catalog description, his hand steady when he did it. The auctioneer's voice thinned noticeably as the floor crew wheeled Lot 19 into place on a rolling platform, since the car had no power of its own to offer. The 1968 Chevrolet Camaro had sat in a barn outside a small town in Missouri for an estimated 20 years. Paint peeled in wide strips down to bare primer. The front bumper hung at an angle. The windshield carried a long diagonal crack. The interior, what could be seen through the glass, had been half claimed by moisture and time. The auctioneer read through the condition report in the flattened tone, reserved for property nobody expects to move. Several people in the front rows stood and stretched. A few drifted toward the exit. Dale Osment, seated near Rosalind Cade, murmured something to her. She glanced at the Camaro, then back at her phone. Silas didn't look away. The opening bid was $150. The room stayed quiet through the repeat. Then Silas raised his paddle. For 50, he said. The auctioneer blinked. Sir, the opening's $150. You can start there. For 50, Silas said again. Theo patted the top of his head. Did we get it, Dad? Dale laughed first. Not quiet, the kind that invites others to join. A few did. Then Rosalind Cade, without fully turning her head, delivered the line that would follow Silas for the next month. For $150. What are you going to do with a pile of scrap metal? The laughter wasn't cruel the way schoolyard cruelty is cruel. It was the laughter of people who'd never needed to think carefully about $450, who couldn't imagine a reason to spend it on something that would have to be dragged off the property. Dismissal dressed up as amusement. Silas didn't look at Rosalind. He looked at Theo, whose face stayed calm because his father's face stayed calm. He trusted that more than he trusted the room. The gavel fell. Silas Grant owned the Camaro for $450. 7 years earlier, Silas had led restoration at Corwin Classic Motors, the most respected vintage car workshop on the coast, whose clients included private collectors who turned up in business magazines, a national transportation museum, and 2 auction houses that requested Corwin's documentation to back provenance claims. He'd started there at 21 and led the department by 29. Colleagues called him the ear because he could listen to an engine run for 30 seconds and tell you what was wrong before the hood came up. He'd left on a Thursday in March, 3 years before Brightmoor. His wife Dana had died in a highway accident on a rainy night when Theo was 2. For nearly a year after, Silas kept working, kept driving the 90 minutes to Corwin, kept coming home late to a son who needed a father fully present, and got a version of him that was mostly functional and sometimes hollow. It was Theo, in the way children make decisions without knowing they're making them, who tipped the scale simply by needing more of him than the road could spare. Silas found work at a smaller garage on the north side of the city. Honest, uncomplicated, fair prices, home in time for dinner and homework. His reputation in the small classic car circle stayed quiet but solid. People who knew the trade knew his name, and people who didn't just saw a man in work clothes. That was usually where the assessment stopped. The night after the auction, once Theo was asleep, Silas pulled a wooden box from under his own bed, one he'd kept sealed for 3 years. Inside was a black and white photograph, soft at the edges, of a man in his late 20s standing beside a car in front of a garage somewhere flat and dry. Nebraska, from the look of the sky. The car was a 1968 Camaro. The paint, even in black and white, had the quality of something that absorbed light rather than threw it back. The man beside it had one hand on the roof and squinted slightly into the sun, looking like someone who'd earned something and wasn't yet used to having it. The man was Silas's grandfather, Arthur Grant. The year, 1968. Silas had carried the paperwork that went with the photo for years, the original title, the build sheet, a window sticker with a faded factory paint code, Sequoia Green. The vehicle identification number on those documents matched the frame number on Lot 19 at Brightmoor. He'd confirmed the match from the catalog before he ever drove there. He'd known exactly what he was going to buy before he walked through the door. This wasn't a random Camaro. It was his grandfather's car. Arthur had sold it in 1991, a year the family needed money more than they needed a car. He rarely spoke of it, and only in the specific way people talk about things they gave up and wish they hadn't. A brief shift in the eyes before changing the subject. He'd never said he regretted it. He'd never had to. Theo appeared in the kitchen doorway for a glass of water and found his father at the table with the old photograph and yellowed papers. Is that the car? That's the car. Is it great-grandpa's? It was a long time ago. Silas set the photo down. I'm going to make it right again. Theo considered this with the full seriousness of an 8-year-old raised to believe mechanical problems had mechanical solutions. Can you, though? It looked pretty broken. Everything's fixable, Silas said. You just have to know where to start. The next morning, a flatbed hauled the Camaro into Silas's garage on Larkin Street. A few neighbors paused to watch the unloading. The car looked worse in daylight. More paint gone, chrome oxidized flat gray, the roof warped along the rear seam. 20 minutes later, Marcus Boyd pulled up in his truck. Marcus, built wide through the shoulders, had worked beside Silas at Corwin for 3 years before Silas left, and now ran his own upholstery shop across town. He walked the Camaro twice without a word, crouched at the frame, and stood. You're serious? 30 days, Silas said. Marcus looked at him, then the car again, then took off his jacket and hung it on the wall. I'm here weekends. Not taking money for it. Silas spent the whole first day just looking, pressing fingers against panels, lifting trim, testing hinges. That was always how he started. Attention before tools, assessment before work. What he found changed the picture. The chassis was sound, genuinely sound. No bent frame rails, no meaningful corrosion. For a car left undisturbed 2 decades, it was the kind of find a restorer recognized as rare without saying so. The body panels told a rougher story. Surface rust, deformation in the left quarter panel, paint gone almost everywhere, but the skeleton beneath was honest. The engine was a 396 cubic inch big block, one of the stronger options offered on the 68. It had been neglected thoroughly. Carburetor gummed past saving. Gaskets failed, timing chain slack. But when Silas pulled the valve covers, the cylinder walls weren't scored and the block hadn't cracked. Damaged, not dead. He found the note when he pulled the instrument cluster. Folded once. Ballpoint ink bled slightly into the paper. Nebraska, 1968. A. Grant. He stood still a long moment, then folded it into his wallet next to his license. That evening he called his grandfather. Arthur answered on the 3rd ring. Careful the way he always was when unsure who was calling. I found it, Silas said. The silence lasted long enough that Silas checked the call hadn't dropped. Then, quietly, where? Missouri. Before that I don't know the whole path, but it's here. Another pause. Is it bad? It's bad, Silas said. But it's all there. He wrote the schedule on a legal pad that night. 5 days full disassembly, 3 days cataloging, 10 days parts and mechanical rebuild, 7 days bodywork, 4 days paint, 2 days interior, 2 days final assembly and road test. 30 days. Tight, but possible. Parts were the hard part. Original spec components for a 68 Camaro existed, but sourcing the right pieces took time the schedule didn't generously allow. He called 3 suppliers that first night, left messages with 2 more, and leaned on accounts and a reputation still active from his Corwin years. By day 2, he had commitments on pistons, camshaft, valve train, and crank bearings within a workable delivery window. On day 6, he drove to Halloway Auto Supply for gaskets and a carburetor kit. The store was run by a man named Ellis Halloway, 30 years selling parts to serious mechanics, who recognized quality of work the way a librarian recognizes a careful reader, by small accumulating signs. Silas was at the Camaro parts rack when a woman came through the door behind him. He registered the sound and kept reading a parts box. Rosalind Cade stood at the counter discussing a display component for the launch of Cade Motors' new Heritage sedan, something sourced to period-accurate spec for a promotional shoot. Precise, no hesitation, the cadence of someone used to being the clearest person in any room. Ellis answered her, then glanced past her at Silas. "You know," he said easily. The fellow over at the Camaro rack restored cars for the State Transportation Museum and Whitfield's auction house, among other places. Rosalind turned and looked at Silas properly for the first time, the way one professional assesses another as a fact rather than dismisses them as a detail. Silas, still reading the carburetor kit, only nodded at Ellis. That was all. Rosalind bought what she needed and left, pausing outside the glass door before walking to her car. She hadn't placed him at the counter, but she'd placed the name. She'd heard Grant, once before, at a conference 2 years back, in a conversation about provenance requirements for a car that sold for over $1 million. Restoration work attributed to a man named Grant from Corwin Classic Motors. That afternoon, she asked her assistant to pull whatever professional record existed for a Silas Grant, formerly of Corwin, currently in the city. What came back didn't match the man she'd seen at Brightmoor in work clothes with a boy on his shoulders, a museum project, an auction house documentation credit. A private commission evaluated independently and described in a report on her screen as technically and historically the most faithful restoration work of its kind completed in 15 years. Dale stopped by her office late that day, having heard through the collector grapevine that the man from the auction was actually working on the Camaro in a garage across town. He laughed, telling her. She didn't. "Who was he?" she asked. Dale repeated himself. "A mechanic, a guy who bought a $450 car." "Before that," she said. "Who was he before that?" Dale didn't know, and left, reading something in her face that said the conversation was over. The weeks in the garage on Larkin Street were the kind that don't announce their own significance while they're happening. Early mornings, late nights, the particular quiet of a man doing something he knows very well without an audience. Theo came after school each day, homework on a folding table near the wall, occasionally looking up to ask a component's name or offer an observation delivered with complete seriousness. "The door panel's the wrong color," he said one Wednesday, holding a paint chip he'd found on the floor. Silas looked at it. "What color do you think it should be?" "Green," Theo said, "like in Great-Grandpa's picture. Dark, like pine trees at night." Silas looked at him. That's exactly right. The paint was the problem he'd expected most. Sequoia green, the factory color on Arthur's original build sheet, had been a Camaro option only for a couple of model years. The formula existed in old technical documentation, but the pigments had shifted since the 60s, and no commercial supplier in the area could match the reference chip closely enough. He called 3 specialty shops in 2 cities. None could hit it precisely. He pulled out a binder from his Corwin years, factory color specs, and mixing ratios assembled over a decade, and found the Sequoia green formula cross-referenced against a discontinued 1989 product code. With the formula, archived colorimetry data, and a spectrophotometer Marcus borrowed from a contact in the auto finishing trade, Silas mixed the paint himself over 2 days of trial and adjustment. Holding the test panel against the old photograph, reading the depth of the finish against the tonal quality of the image, the match was as close as a photograph could confirm. Marcus held the panel at arm's length and didn't speak for a long moment. "Silas, Rosalind Cade's going to see this car eventually. You know that." Silas didn't answer. He was already setting up the spray booth. The engine came together across the 2nd and 3rd weeks the way complex mechanical work comes together when the person doing it has done it many times, not without difficulty, but without uncertainty. Every part that needed replacing was replaced. Everything reconditionable was reconditioned to original spec. On the 14th evening, Silas turned the key for the first time. The engine caught on the second attempt, idled rough for 40 seconds, then steadied. Not yet right. Carburetor needed adjusting. Timing was slightly off, but running. A 50-year-old engine, silent for 2 decades, running in a garage on Larkin Street at 11:40 at night. Marcus put his hands on his head and looked at the ceiling. Theo, asleep on the folding table with his cheek on his homework, lifted his head at the sound. "Did the car say something?" he asked, blinking. "It said it remembered us," Silas told him. Theo accepted this without skepticism and went back to sleep. Bodywork ran from day 15 through 22. The left quarter panel demanded the most: heating, reforming, multiple rounds of finish work before it met Silas's standard. Run your hand across it in low light with your eyes closed, and if you feel anything, do it again. Rust treatment was methodical, primer applied in 3 stages. No step skipped despite the tight schedule. On day 26, the Sequoia Green went on. First coat in the afternoon, second the next morning. The color settled over the bodywork the way a fact settles once confirmed, not as a surprise, but a recognition. Catching light the way it had in 1968, the way it had when Arthur Grant stood beside it in Nebraska squinting into the sun. Marcus arrived on day 27 for buffing and stood in the doorway, without speaking for nearly a minute. "Say something," Silas said. "I'm trying to find the word. Give me a second." The interior came last. Silas sourced period-correct materials for the seats, close to the original black vinyl, and installed the door panels, carpet, and dash components over 3 days. The instrument cluster went back in last. Before securing it, he looked at the panel behind it, carved into the metal since it left the factory, since Arthur drove it home from an Omaha dealership in the spring of 1968. A. Grant. Silas didn't restore it, didn't polish it away or treat it as a flaw. He cleaned carefully around it and set the cluster back with the initials exactly where they'd always been. On day 29, a letter arrived from the Brightmoor Vintage Automotive Showcase, the city's largest annual classic car exhibition, inviting Silas to present the car in the central exhibition space, a position typically reserved by committee, not open application. Silas read it twice, then showed Theo, who was eating cereal. "They want to see our car," Theo said. "Is it ready?" Silas looked toward the garage. He didn't know who had contacted the showcase on his behalf, and didn't ask. What he didn't know, and wouldn't learn until much later, was that Rosalind Cade had made that call herself 2 days after pulling his professional record and reading the evaluator's report. She'd reached the board through an intermediary, suggesting without pressure that a vehicle of unusual historical and technical interest might warrant a central slot. She never mentioned Brightmoor, never told Dale, never told anyone at Cade Motor Holdings. She made the call and went back to work. On the final night, Silas and Marcus finished the last adjustments. Idle mixture, timing advance, a final torque check, at 2:15 in the morning. Both men were past tired. Silas sat on the garage floor against the tool cabinet. Marcus sat across from him near the door. Neither spoke for a while. The Camaro stood under the overhead lights, Sequoia Green holding light with the same unhurried depth it had held in 1968. Every line was where it should be. Marcus picked up his jacket, looked at the car a long moment before putting it on. 30 days, he said. From $450 of scrap. "Silas, do you understand what you've done here?" Silas looked at the car, then at the photograph of Arthur Grant taped to the wall 3 weeks earlier, still curled at one corner. "I brought it home," he said. He carried Theo to bed an hour later. The boy stirred when the garage light went off and asked, in the fog of interrupted sleep, whether the car was finished. "All done," Silas said. "We're showing it tomorrow." "Good," Theo murmured, and was asleep again before his father set him down. Saturday morning arrived clear and dry, the kind of October light, kind of paint finishes. The Brightmoor Showground occupied several acres on the edge of town, and by 8 a.m. more than 80 vehicles sat arranged under white canopies. Silas drove the Camaro there himself, the first time it had moved under its own power on a public road in more than 20 years. The 396 sounded the way it was built to sound, a low, unhurried authority that turned heads at intersections. Theo rode in the passenger seat in a denim jacket, the 1968 photograph held carefully in both hands. "It's the loudest car on the road," he said. "Big engine," Silas said. "I like it," Theo said. Staff directed Silas to the central exhibition space, the exact point where the walkways from all 4 entrances converged. He hadn't been told in advance. He pulled in, cut the engine, and in the silence after the motor stopped, a man 20 feet away turned to look. Then the man beside him turned. Within 2 minutes, a loose arc of a dozen people had formed around the Camaro without anyone organizing them. Theo got out and stood by the front fender holding the photograph. An older collector named Walter Pruitt, attending his 19th showcase and twice present at Corwin when Silas ran restoration there, walked up and studied the car with the quiet, thorough attention of someone who'd learned to tell the difference between cars made to look good and cars made right. He crouched at the rear quarter panel, walked to the front, opened the hood, and stood looking a long time. Then he straightened, looked at Silas, and extended his hand. "Silas Grant, I wondered what you were doing with yourself." A pause. "Now I know." A reporter for the local paper found the car by following the crowd, took photographs, then stood beside Theo, who was explaining the car's history to another boy his age with the authority of someone who'd heard the facts stated precisely and retained them precisely. "This was my great-grandfather's car," Theo said. "He bought it in 1968. My dad found it and fixed it. Took 30 days. The color's called Sequoia Green." The other boy nodded seriously. "What's Sequoia?" Theo considered this. "A very tall, very green place." Rosalind Cade arrived at 10:45, later than planned. In her capacity as Cade Motors' executive representative, the company was a presenting sponsor. From 40 yards out, she could see a crowd larger and more concentrated than any other cluster on the grounds. She moved toward it. The crowd parted the way crowds part for someone carrying executive certainty. Then it parted enough for her to see the car. The Sequoia Green stopped her, not the color alone, extraordinary as it was in the morning light, but the whole of it. The proportions, the chrome reglinting like something new, the engine bay visible through the open hood, the 396 sitting clean and precise as though assembled yesterday rather than rebuilt in a garage 30 days earlier. She remembered exactly what the car had looked like at Brightmoor, the peeling paint, the cracked windshield, the general appearance of something that had given up. What stood in front of her now occupied the same place in her memory, but was otherwise a completely different object. Not restored, returned to something it had been, with complete technical fidelity, by someone she hadn't paused to properly look at when she saw him at the auction with his work clothes and his son on his shoulders. Dale stood to her left. He'd seen the car, then seen Silas standing near it, and hadn't said anything since. Rosalind walked forward through the remaining distance. Silas saw her from 10 steps away and didn't move, didn't change his expression. He simply waited, the way he'd waited when the gavel fell at Brightmoor. She stopped in front of the hood, looked the car over slowly from nose to tail, then looked at Silas. "How long?" 30 days. "From the car at the auction?" "Yes." A pause. Theo moved closer to his father, looking up at her with frank, uncomplicated curiosity. Rosalind looked at the boy a moment. "I said something at the auction," she said, her voice in a different register than the one she used in meetings. Less edge, more directness. "It was unkind. To you and to him." She looked at Theo. "I'm sorry." Silas nodded once, didn't expand on it, didn't rush to close the distance faster than it warranted closing. The nod was enough. Theo said, with perfect sincerity, "That's okay. My dad says mean words usually come from people who haven't looked closely enough yet." Something shifted in Rosalind's face. Not quite a smile, not quite something else. The expression of someone receiving a correction from a direction she hadn't expected. At noon, under the main canopy, the judges' panel made its announcements. Best in Show went to the 1968 Camaro, Central Exhibition Space, owner Silas Grant. Best Restoration went to the same car. The citation read into the microphone. A complete restoration from non-operational condition, executed in 30 days using period-correct components and historically faithful technique, representing the highest standard of work the panel had encountered in the event's history. Applause started at the edges of the crowd and moved inward. Theo jumped and grabbed his father's hand with both of his. Silas stood with his arms at his sides, looking at the podium, then at the photograph, his grandfather at 29 beside the same car in a different decade, the same unassuming posture of a man who'd earned something and wasn't yet used to having it. Marcus had driven to Omaha the previous Thursday without saying where he was going, only that he had an errand and would be back by Saturday morning. He arrived at the showcase just before noon with a passenger, a man of 70, silver-haired, moving slowly across the asphalt with a cane, dressed shoes slightly wrong for the occasion but polished that morning with evident care. Arthur Grant came through the edge of the crowd and stopped when the car came into view. He stood still long enough that people nearby noticed and stepped back, making space without being asked. He moved forward slowly, raised his hand, and set it flat on the hood, directly over the engine, the way a man touches something he's thought about for a long time. His eyes were red at the edges. Theo ran to him and wrapped both arms around his waist. "Great-grandpa, that's your car. Dad fixed it. It took 30 days. Arthur held the boy with one arm and kept the other hand on the hood, unable to speak for a moment. When he could, what he said was quiet enough that only the people nearest him heard it. "I know, sweetheart. I know." Silas stood beside his grandfather and said nothing. Nothing needed saying. The car was there. The three of them were there. That was the complete statement. Rosalind watched from a respectful distance, raising one hand slightly when Dale started to speak. A quiet signal that meant not now. She watched Arthur's hand on the hood and said nothing more herself. Dale had already left the grounds 40 minutes earlier, shaking no one's hand on the way out. Later that afternoon, when the crowd had thinned to the steady drift of people who linger out of genuine interest, Rosalind found Silas near the front of the car while Theo, seated in the passenger seat, explained the instrument gauges to Walter Pruitt through the open window. "I'd like to talk to you about something," she said, "when you have time." Silas waited. "Cade Motor is starting a heritage division," she said. "Restoration and certification. We have the capital and the client base. We don't have the expertise." A pause, careful in a way she usually wasn't. "I think I found it today." Silas looked at her steadily. "What would the work look like?" "That's what I'd want to discuss. On your terms." She was quiet a moment. He looked across the hood at his grandfather, now sitting behind the wheel, hands resting on the original steering column, looking through the windshield at nothing in particular, an expression with no name except peace. "My terms include being here," Silas said, "and being home by dinner." "I understand that," Rosalind said. "Then we can talk," he said. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said they could talk, the right answer for the moment. Measured, honest, uncommitted to anything but the conversation itself. By late afternoon, the showground had the quiet of an event winding down. Folding tables coming apart, owners taking final photographs, long shadows stretching across the asphalt. The Camaro sat in the central space, sequoia green warming slightly as the sun angle shifted, holding its depth at 4 in the afternoon the same way it had at 10 that morning. The mark of paint done correctly. Marcus drove alongside Silas on the way back to Larkin Street. Theo fell asleep against the window before the first intersection, the photograph still in his lap, one hand resting lightly on it. Arthur rode in Marcus's truck, watching the streets go by in the early evening. Silas drove in the particular silence of a man at the end of something completed, the engine running beneath him with the steady authority he'd rebuilt into it. He thought about what Rosalind had said at Brightmoor. For $150, pile of scrap. Words that hadn't been kind and hadn't meant to be, but had become, in some unintentional way, useful. Not motivation in the performative sense, but a kind of clarity. On the 12th day, when the engine had failed to start a third time and Marcus had gone home and Theo was asleep and the garage felt very large and the schedule very short, it had been that clarity, the certainty of what he was doing and why, that kept his hands moving. Some things get undervalued not because they lack worth, but because whoever's doing the valuing hasn't looked long enough, or hard enough, or carefully enough. The car was one of those things. He'd always suspected he might be one, too. He turned onto Larkin Street. The garage light was still on. Marcus must have left it burning when he went to collect Arthur that morning. The door stood open, light falling in a rectangle across the driveway, and Silas pulled the Camaro in and cut the engine. The silence after was the good kind, the kind that comes when something that's been running the way it should finally rests. He sat a moment in the driver's seat, then got out, lifted Theo from the passenger side without waking him, and carried him toward the house. At the door he looked back once. Arthur stood beside the car in the garage, hand on the roof, not moving, not speaking. The specific stillness of someone who doesn't want to rush a moment because they understand some moments don't come around twice. The car was home. The man who'd brought it home went inside. The garage light stayed on a little longer.